much. Thank you. And also thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to show some of my work to you and tell you about the research we're doing on Germany, but also other countries. And it's also great that you're showing up today because the weather is so fantastic today. And yeah, I mean, that's always a decision in science, and you decide for science. So I'm really happy that you're here today. Some people actually even came from Norway, I heard, but probably not just for this presentation, right? But yeah, it's great to be here. The title is slightly alarmist, lies, hate, and chaos, and I will use that as a kind of structuring principle for my talk, and also the subtitle. So before we start, let's do it a bit more interactively, and I have a question with you. Have you seen or heard some disinformation today? If you have, you can raise your hand. Please don't be afraid to raise your hand. I won't ask a follow-up question directly. So have you seen disinformation today? Anybody? All right, 3.5, 4 people, 5 people, maybe 5, getting a bit more. Have you seen or heard some messages on social media today? You can raise your hand if you have heard on social media. Okay, so maybe even on X. No, nobody's using X anymore. But if you would, actually, you would probably see this information in about 10 seconds or so. It actually took me 10 seconds. I did that before the presentation. I looked up my X account. I still have one for scientific reasons. And I was scrolling down, and that's what I got. An AI-generated fake video of Americans working in production now because people are making fun about that, and obviously this was produced by some Chinese account and shared by an anti-Trump account. So 10 seconds. So we're actually kind of seeing that type of, well, some information, disinformation, but fake videos on a regular basis. If you go on social media, it's shared a lot. And this is what I would like to talk about, what you see there. I have a broad range of topics with me. And before we go into the details, I will first tell you a little bit about who we are, what we're doing in Münster, and then I will go to the details. As I said, I will use that as a structuring principle, so I will talk about disinformation first, and then give you some case studies on lies, hate, and chaos. Lies is actually political disinformation for me. Hate is a hate campaign that I will talk about, and chaos is about religious disinformation. Why this chaos, I will come back in a minute. And in the end, I will hopefully have some solutions on what to do about it and how to deal with that in liberal democracies, because that is a big issue for liberal democracies. And maybe then we can go to the discussion. I'm not presenting, by the way, for 2 hours, so 60 minutes max, and then people should start throwing stuff at me and say, please stop, and then we can discuss things. So first, who are we? What are we doing in Münster, the online research group? Just a few words about the University of Münster, because I'm not sure if everybody knows what Münster is. I heard some German in the room, the Germans might know it. So the university in Münster is quite old. It's actually founded in 1780. That's the wonderful palace. That is the main university building. That is where our president and the chancellor are located. I don't have such a nice office, unfortunately. And we have about 45,000 students. It's a big university with 15 departments. I'm actually the dean of one of them, the social sciences department at the moment. Yeah, and it's a very traditional university. Actually, one of the most traditional institutes is the communication studies department at that university, because it was founded in 1919, so it's one of the oldest in the world. It's the second oldest in Germany. Leipzig beat us. They're, I think, like 2 years older than us. And we have about 50 staff, and some of us are working on disinformation. And if we go further into that institute, that's our team, the chair of online communication. And actually one person from that team is also sitting here, Johanna. We're currently 8 researchers, a few student assistants, and we're doing primarily empirical research. So that actually means we're using empirical methods like surveys, content analysis. We also have an experimental lab to find out how people deal with online media, how do they use it, how does it affect them. So it's not just that we're thinking about it, but we're actually getting some data on that. We're observing people doing that, and we try to see how it affects them in their everyday life. And that's also a picture of, by the way, of our VR lab, which is very popular among students because they can play VR games and run around in VR games. They like that very much. That makes us popular among them, I guess. Just a few projects. So we're actually having a project at the moment on how social issues emerge on the internet. And then it comes to the current topic that we're talking about today. Conspiracy theorists, we're talking about them, and esoterics and patchwork religions. I will present some data from that project, which is part of the DFG Excellency Cluster. And then I will talk about hybrid real-time detection of disinformation campaigns, a project that has ended, funded by the German Ministry of Research and Education. We also had some other projects that are kind of similar. As I said, we're doing research with empirical methods on various aspects like disinformation, counterpublics, alternative media, but also the flow of information on the internet, because nowadays you can kind of track that flow of information. So if you're going on the internet, if you're using social media, you're leaving behavioral traces, and we can track them. Unfortunately, not just friendly scientists can do that, but also governments and some services and people that are not as friendly as we are. So I will talk about that a bit later on as well. And we also do some research on political and state elites and how they react to disinformation. So for example, we have done interviews with German politicians, elite politicians, and how they deal with the threats and the hate they get because they're politicians, which is also an issue. I think it was just in the news today that one of the elite politicians in Germany actually said he actually resigned because of the hate he got. And we were interviewing similar people and got information from these. We do that across a lot of platforms. If you're on social media, you might have used some of them. If not, I will tell you a little bit about them. So we're doing also research not only on Facebook and X, but also on new youth-oriented platforms like, for example, TikTok and also Telegram. Telegram I will talk about later on, which is kind of a platform now that is used very much by fringe groups and ideological groups for internal communication. And that's why it's also very relevant for us. And we've done that on a number of topics like climate crisis, COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or also the Middle East conflict and religion and ideology. As I said, I will pick a few of these topics. Today we're talking a little bit about the US. We will be talking about religion and ideology and about right-wing politics in Europe, so that you know what you can prepare for in the next, maybe 55 minutes. I will probably skip the methods part because that's just interesting for the scientists in the room. There's some error, but we can talk about it later on if you're really interested. Probably also Johanna knows much more about that than me because she did some of these studies. So let's go to the actual content. Now you know who the guy is talking to you, and let's go to the major part here. Let's first talk about the disinformation part. How disinformation threatens democracy is also the title of this presentation. It's the presentation with the slightly alarmist poster we had. And if you have a look at disinformation online, actually it has a certain history that a lot of people do not know about. First of all, disinformation as a concept is not as old as we believe it is. I will show you in a minute. People believe it was existing for decades, whereas we can actually see that in the literature and the public discussion, it has been a thing of the, let's say, past 10 to 15 years. Before that, it wasn't really a topic in the public discussion. Although the term itself is derived from a Russian word, has been existing for many, many more decades, but it's not a term that was used widely in science or in the public. However, as I said, there is a certain history to that. So I have a few cases that I brought with you. One of the oldest one I encountered was this one, a website in German that says, say no to drugs, say yes to life. And I actually got that website when my son, I think, was doing some research for school and came across that website and checked it because it looked a bit suspicious to me. And it was seemingly a website on prevention of drug use among young people. When you look a bit more closely, it's actually run by Scientology. So actually the Scientology church was using that website to convince young people to basically, for their faith or their ideology, but you just found it in the fine print. Actually, the material you got there was more or less material for schools and really for drug prevention. There was just this hidden message somewhere in here and there, actually, you know, trying to convince them of the mindset of Scientology. That is probably 20 years old, that example. Same here, that's this website that's now offline, that was existing for a long time, was famous because it was a website that a lot of school kids actually saw on Martin Luther King. Actually, when you were Googling Martin Luther King, it was always the first or the second thing you got on Google when you were looking for Martin Luther King. And that website is actually says civil rights library, but the website, when you were continued to read, you actually found out, okay, this is not very positive how Martin Luther King is depicted there. And if you were looking more closely, you actually found out this was run by Stormfront. Stormfront is a right-wing, very right-wing extremist group in the US. And they were running these websites for a long, long time. Actually, they started in the mid-90s, trying to convince people about their ideology online. However, they weren't saying that they're Stormfront. They were actually claiming to be somebody else. I think that's the main point here. And they tried to manipulate people to actually convince them. The things that you probably remember better is things like that. So there's the Ukraine, Russia conflict. Also there, we have to say that that conflict didn't just start lately, and actually it has been more or less prepared online before that. So we have signs that Russia was trying to influence Western media since about 2012. So, for example, that is from the Guardian. And the Guardian was complaining a lot that in their forums at that time, people showed up claiming to be British people discussing Ukraine, where they actually had some hints that the accounts of these people were in Russia, not in the UK, because they could actually trace the IP addresses back then. And again, that was already it started in 2012, actually preceding the current conflict. So there you could also see that this is used for political reasons and also to influence Western publics towards a specific mindset and goal. If you continue with the history, there are other examples, and I have to also use the US elections here because they will be very, very relevant for us for the development of disinformation research, as we will see that the research, the public discussion actually started in 2016 with the US elections. We had other cases around that time, like the Brexit referendum, that was also discussed heavily in relation to disinformation, because the Brexit campaign was kind of supported or pervaded by non-factual things and disinformation. And actually, we know that there were also PR companies behind that pushed these messages to convince people actually to vote for Brexit. There has been also talk about Cambridge Analytica being involved, so it's a longer story. I don't want to delve too deep into that, but we've seen in 2016 that it really started to become very relevant for the Western world, and not just these single cases that I was shown. In Germany, we were discussing that with the coronavirus from 2020, there has been a huge discussion in our country because there was this anti-vaccination movement, Querdenken, that started in 2020. And funny thing is that we did research on them, and we started to do research in February 2020, and we could already see the movement online, developing online in February, March, before the actual protests happened in the streets, because the protests were in summer, and we could already see online that this was kind of developing, I would say. And then certainly one thing that we're discussing, especially in Europe, is the Ukraine war and the Russian invasion. So disinformation is actually part of that conflict. So it's used, and it's actually used by both sides, but especially by the Russian side. It's used to influence also Western publics to, you know, lower the support or raise the support for one side in that conflict. And that is done also very professionally. We can see that people that are doing that are campaigning here, that are providing that disinformation to Western publics are certainly not amateurs. They're kind of probably state finance people. So a few examples, and as you can see that it has been developing over time, and it's not just my invention, but if you look in the literature, but also in the public discussion, a lot of people actually say disinformation is a central threat to democracy. If it continues like that, we have no information to rely on, and if you don't have factual information to rely on, the very basis of democracy is in danger because people do not have kind of reference points. And not just me is making that point, but you can see here has been discussed here in the Washington Post, the Star, in Germany, the Spiegel, the German government actually discussed it as well. And I'm sure I know that the Canadian government also discussed that. So disinformation is danger, and defined in the literature it is as the intentional spreading of false or misleading information with the intent to harm. So very much like the examples that I was showing you, it's not just, and I will come back to that, it's not just lies. Disinformation can also be campaigning where you actually cut some information or give it a specific spin. So there's always the talk, you know, where does it start and where does it end, and we can talk about that in the discussion. But the examples that I will show you today are not just disinformation in the sense of lies, but there's also things like hate speech and biased information. And sometimes really it's about giving or putting things in a different context. So some variations, as I said, it's not just lies. We made a model on that. And so basically, if you look at the content and what humans are doing, you can actually differentiate variations of this information. So on this level of the content, it can be misleading, you can add things, you can omit things, as I mentioned, or you can completely fabricate content. And on the level of the individual, actually some people do it intentional, and some people just do it on accident, like bad reporting could be considered also like disinformation or misinformation. But as they are not doing that intentionally, usually they shouldn't, then we wouldn't define it as disinformation because the intent to harm is missing and also the planning. So we're basically looking primarily at this sort of fabricated stuff or stuff that could also add misleading and the added stuff, but it needs to be intentional. Some people want you to believe that the reality is different or want to convince you about a certain ideology. And I said 2016 was more or less the starting point, so the US elections. And I'm not just making that up. I said we are doing empirical research, and Johanna, who is one of the authors on the paper, is sitting here, and we've done research on that. We actually did an analysis of literature databases, and we looked actually for the term disinformation, fake news, misinformation, and so on. And what we found is actually there was no work on that before 2016. That's the statistics. We had a look at the publications there. Since 2016, we had more than 8,000 publications on disinformation in various fields like computer science, psychology, and the social sciences. And naturally, 2016 was actually connected to Trump. That's no question, because empirically it's super obvious, right? There's nothing before, and then all of a sudden it kind of exploded. You could do the same thing, by the way, for newspapers. We haven't done that here. This is just for scientific publications, but you would find the exact same pattern. The topic wasn't a topic before the 2016 elections. Since then, we have seen a few more kind of things that added to it. So we have like a development over time, and I make it also a bit more obvious that COVID was another factor to actually push it. And then there was the Ukraine and Russia war that again pushed the publications in that field. By the way, it goes down here because we actually did that in 2024. And so it actually doesn't include the full year. That's actually why it goes down here. If you would look at it now, it would go up So actually, it's still growing. So again, the field wasn't existing before, and it's kind of linked to the US election. And therefore, I will have a very brief look at the US, but just very briefly, because I find it a bit unfair to talk about the US very much because I'm German. But I have to mention it because it's relevant for the development of that field. And there I will go to the case studies. And first I will talk, as I said, about political disinformation. That's the lies part, then about hate speech, and then about the chaos part. And in the lies part, unfortunately, I have to again mention the US government. Yeah, so why? Because political disinformation at the moment is really like a battlefield. As we can see here, and also it takes 10 seconds to find stuff like that, right? These are non-factual pictures. I can assure you that never happened. I didn't do them myself, but an AI did that, obviously. So there's like the battle between Biden and Trump. You saw pictures like that during the US elections a lot. Also, Angela Merkel, our former chancellor, dancing with Putin. It was not happening. I'm not sure whether she danced at one point with him. I'm not sure, but probably not. And I'm also pretty sure that this picture is not factual. The thing is, it's super easy to produce content like that nowadays with AI. So it is used in political disinformation, and it's not just used, you know, like these famous pictures from the 19 whatever 10s, 20s, where people faked individual pictures. But this is happening on a daily basis, and you can get thousands of these. And if you're not using social media, but you have kids, they see that every single day. And it's getting harder and harder to actually see what is right and what is wrong. And we could see that during the US elections last year. That was like a peak point where AI was actually used to disinform the people. So we had things like this, so there, you probably remember that when Donald Trump said they're eating pets there about immigrants that came to the country, then there were pictures like that where you had Trump actually protecting a lot of these pets and animals, cats, or he was taking them away. The immigrants were following him and wanted to eat the cats. Again, that was naturally fake content. Interesting enough, it was used by both sides. So it's not just, you know, because sometimes you get the impression it's just the current administration or the Trump people that were using it, but that's not true. Actually, the Democrats also used it a lot, also to mock Trump. So it was actually both sides that used a lot of fake content in the political process. Also, this guy used it, by the way, look at it, who wrote it. So it's Elon Musk, actually, did you probably know. And actually, Elon Musk shared a post by Donald Trump, who shared a post mocking Kamala Harris with a fake picture. So you see that this was really part of the political process. This is easy to detect, but it's getting a bit more difficult when you have stuff like this. This is from Facebook. So this person actually found a picture of Donald Trump during Hurricane Helene, and actually the MAGA people actually said, oh, people actually don't, or the media don't want to show how Trump helped the people, because Trump went there with his genes and went there and were helping the people in the hurricane. Obviously, this is fake because if you look at his fingers, they look very suspicious. Right, because he has like just 3.5 fingers or so on this hand, and they actually look a bit strange. In the beginning, actually, AI-generated pictures were easy to detect because usually people had like 3 arms, 2 heads, or 7 fingers or so. It's getting better. This is probably not existing anymore, that type of fake that is so easy to detect. But if you just look at the picture, you couldn't think it's factual. You know, he's running around there. Yes, we would get the context, and probably he wouldn't run around with his jeans in the water. But still, some people actually believe it. You know, and then they say, okay, so this guy said Facebook doesn't want this picture on Facebook. They did start deleting all these pictures, not because they were fake, but because they're factual. Again, you see how that was used. Also, this example, Taylor Swift. was used in the political process as a superstar. And here on the left, you, for example, see two examples that are pretty similar. So the left one was actually fake, the right one was true. So a person showing up with a Taylor Swift T-shirt at a MAGA rally. The right one was actual picture because there was somebody showing up with that T-shirt, whereas the left one was a fake. Actually, the little circles actually show you where you can actually detect that it's a fake, because actually the writing is wrong. That person has two coffees that look exactly the same and things like that. So again, there's a lot of things going on. It's not just, by the way, pictures. That's what a lot of people think. We just get these pictures. During the US elections 24, also audio was used for fakes. So people also got robocalls from, for example, Biden, that were fake. You know, in the US, you get these robocalls from candidates to make announcements or to convince you. And some people actually used fake robocalls, you know, that actually mocked the other side or actually gave the wrong information. And audio is actually much harder to detect than video, because very often the context is missing. With video, very often you can detect it. It's easy to see, you know, Donald Trump's running around there in his jeans. That doesn't look very good, doesn't look factual. But with audio, very often people believe, because they just get the voice and then they think that must be true. So this is really overlooked in a way, also by research, audio fakes, and it's part of this AI-generated disinformation trend there. Probably will skip one or two slides. So what we see here is a certain range of things how disinformation is used with AI. We have the typical compromat, so to kind of get fake data to destroy a person. We have disinformation campaigns against groups. We have discrediting journalism, and we have disinformation campaigns against parties and state institutions, and also these dark narratives about the disintegration of society. There's a huge range of things that you can do with it. And AI actually adds to that, because we get more depth, more specificity, but we also get more volume. It's much easier to produce that in large quantities. Formerly, you had to do it by hand. Then you can basically flood the internet with so much stuff that actually people don't know what's right and wrong. And that is an interesting effect, because these direct effects are not the biggest issue. So there has been research on that, also for the US election, that says actually all that stuff we've seen didn't really influence the elections. Even the EU did a project on that. And they basically came to the conclusion that, contrary to the predictions, AI actually didn't disrupt the outcome of the elections. So basically, the direct effects are limited. However, as I said, there's another effect, and that is the indirect effects. Because if you know that there's disinformation out there, it can be used for political discourse and for political discussions. And so there's one concept that's called the liar's dividend, that was kind of invented by two colleagues, Chesney and Citron. They actually say, if you're a politician and you claim to be the object of disinformation, it benefits you. And in the US elections, for example, Donald Trump was using that several times, claiming to be the object of disinformation, and then actually profited with his supporters, because they actually said, oh yeah, he's kind of the object, and so the other side is really nasty to him, and he's our hero, right? It also produces a lot of conspiracy theories. If you know there's disinformation out there, and then you get these system renegades, and also it actually contributes to distrust in the system overall. So actually, disinformation mustn't just work, directly where people get the wrong information and then react in the wrong way. It's sufficient that they know it's existing. And this effect doesn't even rely on the existence of disinformation, because It's just enough to claim that it's out there. And that effect is very, very strong, actually, much stronger than the direct effects. And we also know from some other studies that there's this kind of placebo effect, especially also with AI, where people assume things are working, and because they assume it is working, it is actually working. So that actually leads to this doubt in the system, everything is lie, everything is a problem. So I said I will just talk briefly about the US, and I will move on a bit to the European context and go a bit more towards the hate side of it, because hate is also part of the political process nowadays, using this information to discredit people. And for that, I brought you an example from TikTok. Not sure who's using TikTok in the room, any users of TikTok in the room. Probably not the age range. There's Chris is like for professional reasons, yes. So yeah, TikTok use. As you can see by age, actually some of the people here in the room are probably above 18. I am certainly above 18, so I'm not really in the age range. But the younger people actually use it also for news. Actually, they think TikTok is a good source for news. We have research from the Reuters Institute that shows us TikTok is very relevant for information in a certain age range. And that is a bit worrying because there is also political communication on TikTok where people try to influence young people for a specific political interest, also with disinformation. And for example, in Germany, it has been used a lot by the right-wing AfD party. There has been a lot of press coverage on that because they were among the first to actually use it professionally. And then there was a big panic among the other parties saying, oh, the right-wing party is so professional, we have to do it ourselves. And you could see during the last elections that a lot of the German politicians actually went to TikTok and made these TikTok videos that are slightly embarrassing, I would say, to convince young people that they're super cool and know the young media. I'm not sure whether that worked, but they were trying. So we were actually asking them, because that's, we have press coverage about it, but we wanted to get empirical insight. Is that actually true? Is right-wing or extremist parties overrepresented? And we actually had a look at the 27 EU member states, actually not statutes, and how they actually use TikTok for political communication and how they're connected. And how we did that, so we took the TikTok presence and the hashtag networks of all members of the parliament and analyzed it. So that's quite a lot of people. That's actually 6,375 members of the parliament, and then in all these member states, and they had released more than 120,000 videos. So what did we find? Core finding. So first of all, actually European politicians aren't all, they're not so active on TikTok. I would say it's 32%, but at least it's 1/3. And what we found is in most of the countries, right-wing politicians, not in most, but in quite a few countries, right-wing politicians are overrepresented, 12. And right-wing politicians also had a higher overall posting activity in almost all EU countries. So in Germany, as an example, 10.67% of the analyzed TikTok accounts can be linked to the populist right-wing politicians, so it's just 10%. However, they actually produce nearly half of the content. So just a few people, but they produce a big chunk of the content. And you can see that also if you have a look at this fancy graph. So that is actually a network graph where the accounts are located and the hashtags. And if you would have a closer look, you would see that the little dots and connections. So it's a network, but it's so densely connected that it just looks like this pretty hairball, as we call it. What you can see on this side, and I will probably come over, these are all the member states, these are all the hashtags and all the people that are there, and the colors actually depict the various member states, so the nations that we have there. And then on the other side, the blue and the orange one, You see the right-wing accounts, they're the orange, brownish ones, and the blue ones are the non-right-wing accounts. So, what does that tell us? That actually tells us something about some countries, because that is Germany. That country, that orange one down there. And as you can see in the case of Germany, so this is the same network, just colored in a different way with the right-wing accounts and the hashtags. As you can see, a big chunk of what is happening on TikTok here in Germany is actually right-wing communication. And much more, by the way, than in other countries. The other one up there, by the way, that is Poland. I think that's the other orange thing that you see up there. So there are some countries where right-wing parties are very active and try to influence the people in that country. And unfortunately, I have to say, Germany is one of the leading ones here. So this is the statistic that we have here. So what you see here again, the orange part is the right-wing percentage or the amount of right-wing communication on TikTok, and the red line is the actual representation of these people. And as you can see, for example, in the Netherlands, which is top here, there's a big amount of right-wing communication, and you see it's much higher than what you have here, because the red one is probably not. I'm not sure whether you can see it easily, but the actual representation is probably half of it. So it's much, much overrepresented. Also in Germany, and there it's even worse, as you can see, there's just a very small amount of, or a small percentage of right-wing politicians. That's where the red thing is. And then you see the orange thing is much, much bigger, that actually it's very much overrepresented. Right? So the take-home message here is actually these people are using that for political reasons, and they're kind of trying to influence people, and they're super active. And also, I think I have to give them that, they're very professional in the way that how they do it. And so we've done a case study, and I told you that I'm also talking about political hate here. We've done a case study on an event called Stolzmonat. So the Germans in the room might recognize that as a kind of a literal translation of Pride Month, because actually Stolz means pride, but it's actually not Pride Month. It's actually kind of the opposite of Pride Month, because some people actually came up with this idea that they use Pride Month to push the idea to be proud of your country, like a patriotic movement. But it was actually used as a kind of a counter to Pride Month. So it was actively installed as a counter event to what they consider the woke Pride Month. So we had a look at that. We saw in the videos that were supporting that quite a few of them actually were linked to a right-wing party. But we also found other things there that actually we found pretty worrying. So, as I said, the supporters of that campaign used that and showed the German flag instead of the pride flag to show their national pride. And again, we did that on TikTok. Here are some of the videos that you got there. And I will just show you a few of the groups that we found there that were actually supporting that. So, again, we did that over time. We did that with empirical methods, but I don't want to bore you with all the details. So we actually looked at the topics, how they developed over time, and also who was involved there. That had to look at the individual videos. So this is how the network looks again, and here probably you can see that it's an actual network because it's not as dense. And again, the colors depict various groups here that were pushing this information. And so we found, as I said, some people from the AfD that were pushing Stolzmonat, but we also found other people. So we found outspoken right-wing groups that were pushing it. Then we found anti-government cluster that were clearly against the constitution. And we also found, and that was very interesting, I will come back to that, also quite a bit of foreign non-German speaking content. So some people from other countries seem to have an interest in Stolzmonat with a German title and just German language, and that were supporting that campaign for some reason. And we will have a look at that group in a second. What we also found is actually the LGBTQI plus cluster, actually people opposing that, so that were actually pushing the actual Pride Month, and they were kind of having their own counter campaign to that kind of right-wing campaign in Stolzmonat. So, as I said, I will give you a few examples. It's probably that graph isn't telling you much, but I give you a few examples who was involved there. So, for example, we have the AfD accounts. The AfD accounts that pushed it were very family-friendly, I would say. Politically acceptable, young people pushing that, saying, I'm proud of my country, that's fine. Promoting home security and freedom. So, at the first look, nothing too worrying, just really a clean, friendly, mainstream look with these accounts. But however, we found other people. As I said, we had these anti-government people that pushed that. So there were things like Kids Stand Up. So it was really directed at young people, stand up against the government, stand up against that system that is actually kind of enslaving you and things like that. There were people from the anti-COVID movement involved there, and that were talking about still talking about the WHO dictatorship. Again, this was not about COVID, right? This was about something completely different, but they still linked it to it. We had anti-Semitic content and also like the safe narrative, like save Germany from all of this stuff. Interesting enough, also they used the peace emoji and used kind of playful visuals to push their content, so it was really directed at kids and young people. Then we had kind of cheap amplification accounts, and these were like people that were using kind of gamified elements to trigger discussions, again, directed at young people. And here we are really talking about right-wing extremists. These were kind of Nazi accounts. And then we're pushing it with names including 88, which is kind of a link to Nazis, because it actually refers to the alphabet. I don't want to go into detail here, but we had clearly people that used that to amplify their ideology and were spreading hate and lies in that campaign. And I was saying, we also found accounts that weren't from Germany. So what we also had in that campaign were pro-Russian propaganda accounts that were basically use memes and ideas that were against Germany, against Ukraine, and pro-Russia. Again, in a campaign that had actually nothing to do with that in the beginning, but they used it to kind of increase the noise or actually push their messages. So, and as I said, I think I have to mention that, so there was this counter campaign by the LGBTQ movement where they actually tried to re-own the narrative to get it back. And so there was this battle going on between these two groups. And the LGBTQ plus people, they actually tried to use kind of humor and mocked that campaign to basically get the message back and actually to reconquer Pride Month against that attack. So, I know this is not a really uplifting topic, afternoon at 3 o'clock or so, but I will come to a even more worrying development that probably not many people know about, which is also kind of linked to this kind of pushing ideological messages, using disinformation, especially directed at young people. And this is from a project that we do in the Excellence Cluster Religion and Politics in Münster, where we analyze, for example, Telegram groups and the use of ideology and spiritual and religious ideas there. So we have also people from religious studies in that cluster, but we're looking especially at the kind of patchwork religions here and new things like new esoteric movements. And that's also a picture that we already used from Telegram, because you will see a lot of really cheap AI-produced pictures in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So, what do we think they are, these patchwork groups? What you see there, if you go online, you see on Telegram, but also on TikTok and other platforms. You will see things like this, like these cheap fairy types. Then you have the people that are meditating, which is kind of nice. But then you get also people that have a business, so they try to sell you, I don't know, stones from Arizona that make you happy, or I'm not sure what they do, but they cost $6.90. Then you have people that want to find out about actually the construction of the world, that actually have an interest in how the world was created. But you also have other people. So what we again found here was links to the movements that I've shown you before. So we found people in that esoteric bubble, in a way, that were actually linking it to right-wing ideology. And also we're kind of anti-government. So again, here, that was a disinformation thing that came from one of these groups claiming that the former chancellor was somehow related to neo-Nazis or whatever. And also we have conspiracy theorists. We found the same people that we found also during COVID. We found that esoteric bubble. So here it's very broad. We look at people that have various esoteric worldviews, spiritual and religious influences. Sometimes they're linked to some social issues. Some of them are using disinformation, some are not. So it's really a mixed bag of things. I will show you some of the data. So we actually analyzed that in Telegram. We did cluster analysis and looked at the various groups that we have here. I, again, don't want to go too much into the detail of the methods, but what we did here, we did a social network analysis of chats that we had there with 13.5 million messages that we actually kind of crawled, and then identified from that bigger group the actual esoteric groups. That's the inner circle here, and had a look at what they're talking about and who is involved. So again, you see this funny, colorful network of people that were involved there and the messages that you had. So how we do that, the clustering, it's probably a bit too detailed for a talk like this, but basically with empirical methods, you can differentiate the people that are involved there and the groups that are there. So you have like, we found the people that are really like the spiritual movement, you could differentiate that. But we also had a political aspect, so that was kind of its own group there within that religious movement. Then we had people that were talking about everything and just had some tag on spiritual content. And then we also had people that were kind of into witches and selling stuff and interesting other things that I will show you in a second. So from these clusters, we had a look at the individual groups. We had a look at what are they pushing, what are the actors there, what can you find there. And these are already a few of the pictures of the witches that we will see in a second. From that, we identified 4 groups: the magicians, the healers, then we identified the esoteric accounts, the AI-generated ones, and also lifestyle esotericism. So basically, the further you go to the right, the more heterogeneous they become, and the further you go up, the more it is about a specific ideology. What does that mean? How do they look like? In principle, you found, for example, people that are believing in astrology. That's fine. How to use explanations for the life world and use zodiac signs and whatever. That was not too problematic, right? Then we found business accounts there that were spreading ideas to make money, and also they were like, how can you become a witch? You buy this stone and then you're a witch and then you're powerful and things will be great for you. So the accounts there, and actually our suspicion was this is an industry for young people to sell, because it was also very colorful, always these beautiful young ladies that were selling stuff to people. And it looked very much like a big industry that is kind of hidden underneath that superficial level. Then we also found witch talk that we found interesting.
So there was actually a subculture of self-identified witches that actually promote services and products, how everybody can become a witch if you want to. You can buy also stuff where you can read the futures or probably buy on a room, I'm not sure. But that's actually a big part of what we found there also on TikTok. And we were like, yeah, surprised what is out there. And now comes the more worrying part, and that's actually the one I want to get to, because on that very superficial level of slightly disturbing things about witches and so on, we also found people that were actually using that, piggybacking on that, to actually use that to spread disinformation. So among these people, we found a lot of people that were undermining science, that actually science is not existing, and probably that step is easy if you're believing in witches, that actually if you're not believing in science. We also found a lot of people that were pushing alternative medicine, which is frankly just dangerous, because actually some of that was, stuff that if you take it, you're probably, I'm not sure, the best thing that can happen to you is actually pay a lot of money for something that is just water. The worst thing that can happen to you is that you take something that is absolutely unhealthy. Then there was also this kind of alternative pseudo-psychology that was used there, and that was using bits of psychology and actually using it to promote ideas how to influence other people. And what we also found again was, I have to say, the links to the far-right ideology. So actually people that were referring to shamans and so on, but actually it was basically also again neo-Nazi content. So they're actually pretty good at using all of these youth movements and all these things for their own purpose. And from all the projects that we've done, wherever we go, we find the exact same type of people spreading this information and using it for ideological or political purposes. So to sum this up or to come to a conclusion, because I was like talking for nearly an hour now about probably slightly depressing things, just slightly. I want to end with a more positive note or some idea how what we could do against them. Because I think a lot of what we have out there is also a misunderstanding of how society works these days. Because very often we get this idea of polarization. Like we have a society that is split or is getting more split and it's getting divided, right? So we have A and B. There's probably one nation where this kind of fits at the moment, that's the US. However, for a lot of Western countries, actually that model doesn't work. And it's probably also not really working for the US. Because when we look at Germany and the things that I've shown you, and also the examples from Europe, so we've seen in these movements, for example, the movement during COVID and after that, it's not just right-wing people or just a specific political ideology, but it's a mixture of things that was completely divided before. So we had the peace movement marching against the government next to people that were neo-Nazis. But we also had really weird people. We had QAnon people there. We had strange people that were saying, okay, I'm against the government, that were wearing these tinfoil hats and whatever. So it's really not just two people or two parties being involved. So what we have nowadays is really multi-dimensional shifts in society. And this is more like a model where how I think society works these days. So we have multiple groups here, and I just have 3 here. And what you need for a society is kind of mutual understanding. They have to have some kind of overlap where they can talk to each other. What you also have in a society is certainly disagreement, which is fine, absolutely fine. I think we have to stop thinking about society as that disagreement is something negative. There's a term by Chantal Mouffe, that's a philosopher, she said there's something in society that's called agonistic pluralism. So basically, a part of society where you actually disagree on things, but you still have a common basis that you can refer to. And the problem here with disinformation is actually that it wants to destroy that. So it's not just about the disagreement, it's actually about the destruction of the very fabric of that society. And actually, that's still slightly depressing in a way. What you can see, for example, in the US, but also in the Western world, is not something that is coincidence, because this idea to destroy the basis of democracy, or to actually at least kind of manipulate the basis of democracy, that has been declared multiple times by interested parties. So there's the idea, for example, of the so-called overtone window, which goes back to a conservative think tank in the US. They actually said what you have to do if you want to install a specific, for example, right-wing or other ideology, you have to push the window of what is thinkable, what you can talk about in a society towards your specific position. So you basically install wrong things, you install disinformation, you install extremes, and then the idea is when you do that, you install these extreme ideas, the rest of the society will actually follow. That has been declared. It's a theory that is supported by a lot of these people, and it's actually not something that is a coincidence. However, what we also can see is that this is not always the case, and that's also the problem, because sometimes you see it moves, some parts of society move, but you also have the counter effect, which is repulsion. So basically, other groups of society go to the other direction, and then actually you get these kinds of splits and rifts in a society. And just imagine if everybody would do that, you would get this. So you would have kind of shifts in the narratives in the society that will go and in all directions, and basically the area where you still can talk is actually not existing anymore. You're losing the cohesion of your society, and then basically you still get this repulsion effect. It goes further apart, and then in the end point we have something like this, where you have a society where each part of the society cannot talk to each other. They build their own little worlds where they argue and sometimes agree and disagree, but they do not speak to each other anymore. And that is the biggest issue, I think, for a society where you have antagonism that is actually actual antagonism, where you do not have a discussion in the society anymore. And I said I would end up with something positive. That's not positive, I know, but there are solutions to that. So what can you do? There's actually two things you can do. If you have a type A society where you still have coherence, there are some solutions that work. If you have a type B, then you also have some solutions. So for type A, where you still have a debate in a society, you should build resilience. You should make people aware of these processes, maybe like this talk. Identify these sources of disintegration in a society, and also stop the external forces of disintegration. People that actually want to influence you, you have to point it out. You have to say, this is happening. This is not a coincidence. And you have to find a joint narrative again. You actually have to debate, you have to disagree, but you have to talk to each other. You have to strengthen that joint narrative of a society. If you have the second type, and some countries will come to my mind where this is the case, what we see at the moment is that these groups actually kind of do not talk to each other. They hate each other. And that is a problem. What you have to do is actually to get your society together again. You have to bridge these gaps. So you have to overcome this negative antagonism where you actually do not consider the other as a partner in a dialogue in the society, but as your enemy. And you have to find your some common ground. So basically, the biggest problem that you have is in societies like that you have to overcome that situation that you're not talking to the neighbor that has a different opinion. Because you say that opinion is so far away from you that I even cannot talk to that person anymore. So really that is actually the task if your societies are already kind of disintegrated. And with that, I think we're at the end. I said there are solutions to that, and probably we can discuss these solutions after this talk, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.